Tonight, we're going to talk about a city that should not exist. A city built on water, held up by wooden posts driven into mud more than 1,000 years ago. A city that has no roads, no cars, no horses, and yet, for centuries, it was the beating heart of trade, art, and power in the Mediterranean. Tonight, we drift back through 1,100 years of history to trace how a handful of frightened refugees, hiding in a marsh, went on to build one of the greatest maritime empires the world has ever known. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, let your breathing slow, and let the soft tide of Venice's story carry you gently through the ages. Our tale begins not with palaces or golden domes, but with a swamp. A wide, shallow lagoon on the northeastern coast of Italy, where the rivers of the Alps come to rest before quietly slipping into the Adriatic Sea. For thousands of years, this stretch of muddy water was home only to fishermen, salt gatherers, and long-legged birds picking their way through the reeds. It was the kind of place travelers avoided. Too wet to farm, too shallow to sail through easily, and prone to mist so thick you could lose yourself just a few steps from shore. And yet, that very inconvenience, that soft and misty inaccessibility, would one day become its greatest gift. To understand why anyone would choose to live in such a place, we have to travel back to the last days of the Roman Empire. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome was crumbling. The great empire that had stitched together lands from Britain to Persia was fraying at the edges. Barbarian tribes were pressing in from every direction, and the northern provinces of Italy, wealthy, cultured cities like Aquileia, Padua, and Altino, found themselves suddenly exposed. First came the Visigoths, sweeping down under a chieftain named Alaric. Then came the Huns, led by Attila, the man Romans nicknamed the Scourge of God. In 452, Attila's horsemen thundered across the plains and burned the great city of Aquileia to the ground. Its people, those who survived, fled with only what they could carry. Where do you go when your city is gone and the roads themselves are unsafe? You go somewhere the horsemen cannot follow. You go into the water. And so, in small boats laden with children and grandmothers, with icons rescued from burning churches and sacks of grain and jars of oil, the refugees pushed out into the lagoon. They found low islands, little more than sandbars really, poking up through the shallow water. Places called Torcello, Burano, Malamocco, and one modest cluster that would one day be called Rialto. Here, wrapped in mist, protected by miles of mud too shallow for warships and too deep for cavalry, they began quietly and stubbornly to build a new life. At first, it was meant to be temporary. Surely, once the invasions passed, they would return home. But wave after wave of trouble kept coming. The Ostrogoths, the Lombards, and then more. Each new crisis sent another trickle of frightened families into the lagoon, and slowly, without anyone quite deciding it, the temporary refuge became permanent. The children of the refugees grew up not knowing the wheat fields their parents had left behind. They knew the tide instead. They knew the taste of salt on the wind, the language of the gulls, and the trick of pushing a flat-bottomed boat through channels so shallow that a stranger would run aground within minutes. By the 6th century, these scattered island communities were beginning to think of themselves as something more than a collection of fugitives. They had built simple wooden churches. They had elected local leaders, called tribunes, to keep order. They fell, at least in name, under the distant authority of the Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of Rome, whose emperors ruled far away in the shining city of Constantinople. That distant connection would matter. It gave Venice a sense of belonging to something grand and legitimate, while also being conveniently far enough away that Constantinople could not really tell them what to do. Around this time, a wonderful legend was born. It was said that on the 25th of March, in the year 421, exactly at midday, the very first stone of Venice was laid at the little church of San Giacomo di Rialto. Historians today are quite certain this precise founding never happened. The truth is far messier and much more gradual, unfolding over centuries. But the Venetians loved a good origin story, and they clung to that date the way we all sometimes cling to comforting tales. It gave their strange floating city a sense of purpose, a beginning, a birthday, as though the whole thing had been planned from the start rather than improvised in a panic. Now, life on the lagoon was not romantic in those early years. It was hard, muddy, and often lonely. Homes were built on stilts of alder and oak. tree trunks driven down through the water into the harder clay below. Amazingly, submerged in oxygen-free mud, the wood did not rot. Instead, it slowly petrified, hardening into something almost like stone. This one strange trick of nature, discovered by desperate people trying not to sink into a swamp, would eventually allow Venetians to build cathedrals and palaces on ground that any modern engineer would call impossible. But there was very little to eat beyond fish and shellfish, very little to drink beyond rainwater carefully collected in cisterns, and very little to trade beyond one humble, ancient commodity: salt. The Venetians became masters of the salt pan, letting seawater evaporate in shallow ponds until only white crystals remained. In a world before refrigeration, salt was essential. Salt preserved meat, salt cured fish, salt paid soldiers. Where there was salt, there was money. And so the little swamp villages began to accumulate a small, quiet fortune. By the 7th century, the scattered islands realized they would be stronger together. In the year 697, according to Venetian tradition, they elected their first doge. That word, doge, comes from the Latin dux, meaning leader or duke. It sounds grand, and yet the first doge was more like a first among equals, chosen by the leading families to guide them. His name was Paolo Lucio Anafasto, though even his existence is a little uncertain in the historical record. Whether he was real or half-remembered legend, the office he began would endure for more than 1,000 years, one of the longest continuous political institutions in European history. Doges would rule Venice until the 18th century, when Napoleon himself would finally sweep the last one away. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let the mind slow, let the boats rock gently in the lagoon, and let us stay for now in the misty morning of the young republic. In 810, Venice faced its first serious test as a united community. The mighty king of the Franks, Charlemagne, had built an enormous empire stretching across much of Western Europe. His son, Pepin, decided the lagoon should be part of it. Pepin arrived with a large army and a fleet of ships and began attacking the islands one by one. Malamocco, then the political center, fell into his hands. Things looked dire. The islanders, however, knew something Pepin did not. They knew the tides. They knew where the water was shallow enough to swallow a ship and where the mud was soft enough to trap a horse. Slowly, patiently, they retreated deeper into the lagoon, drawing the Frankish forces after them, and then, when the tide turned, they struck. Legend says fisherwomen on the islands guided their boats with sticks, showing them where to sail, and old men shouted false directions to confuse the enemy. Whatever really happened, Pepin's fleet foundered in the mud, and his army melted away in defeat. That victory changed everything. The Venetians moved their capital to a cluster of islands right in the middle of the lagoon, the safest, most defensible spot they could find. They called it Rivo Alto, the high bank. In time, that name would be worn smooth by centuries of use into a single word, Rialto. Around it, the city we now know as Venice would slowly grow. Canals were dug. Bridges were thrown across. Wooden houses were replaced with brick and stone. And through it all, the strange rhythm of tide and mist continued to protect them, as it had from the very beginning. The 9th century brought another gift, one that gave the young city something it needed almost as badly as money and walls. It gave them a saint. In 828, two Venetian merchants named Buono and Rustico were trading in the great city of Alexandria in Egypt, then under the rule of a Muslim caliph. Word had reached Venice that the tomb of Saint Mark the Evangelist, one of the 4 gospel writers, lay in Alexandria, and that the Venetians, being clever and audacious, decided to bring him home. Whether by theft, bribery, or a combination of both, they carried the saint's relics out of Egypt hidden, so the story goes, beneath layers of pork, which the Muslim customs officials would not touch. The relics arrived safely in Venice and were placed in a magnificent new basilica, which would grow, over the centuries, into one of the most breathtaking churches in all of Christendom. Saint Mark became Venice's patron, and his symbol, a winged lion holding an open book, would become the flag under which Venetian ships sailed to the ends of the known world. With a saint, a doge, a fortress city built on impossible ground, and a growing appetite for trade, Venice was almost ready to step onto the great stage of history. Almost, but not quite. There were still centuries of quiet growth ahead, of slow accumulation of wealth and skill, of learning to build better ships and strike better bargains, of watching, always watching, the ancient rivalry between East and West that would soon spill into the great adventure we call the Crusades. And it was in those adventures that our humble swamp city would begin its transformation into something the world had never seen before. A republic of merchants, a queen of the seas. An empire built not on land, but on water. Rest easy now, breathe softly, and let us drift back into the lagoon, where the tide is turning and the 10th century is dawning over the rooftops of a still young Venice. The city we left in our last chapter was a cluster of stubborn islands with a patron saint, a leader called the Doge, and a growing knowledge of how to survive on water. But it was still small, still humble, still overshadowed by the great civilizations that surrounded it. To the east lay Constantinople, the shimmering capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city of 1,000,000 souls and 100 golden domes. To the south lay the Muslim Caliphate, wealthy beyond measure, controlling the spice routes to India and the gold trade of Africa. And to the west lay the fractured Christian kingdoms of Europe, still recovering from the collapse of Rome. Venice sat quietly in the middle of all of them, listening, watching, and beginning to plan. The 10th and 11th centuries were, for Venice, a slow and patient time of building, not just building homes and churches, but building networks. Venetian merchants began to appear in every major port of the Mediterranean. They carried salt, of course, and dried fish and glass, for the glassmakers of Venice were already famous. But they carried something else too. They carried themselves, their language, their contracts, their reliability. A Venetian promise, it was said, was worth more than a Genoese oath or a Pisan handshake. Whether that was actually true mattered less than the reputation itself. Reputation was capital, and Venice was accumulating it faster than gold. The doges of this era were canny men, walking a careful line between the great powers. They still, at least in theory, owed loyalty to the emperor in Constantinople, and this suited them perfectly. The Byzantine connection gave Venetian merchants special privileges in the ports of the Eastern Empire. They could trade without paying the taxes other foreigners paid. They could set up their own neighborhoods, their own warehouses, their own churches in cities like Constantinople and Antioch. And when the Byzantines needed help, when their own navy was too small or too slow, they turned to Venice, and Venice, for a suitable price, was always happy to help. That price kept rising. In 1082, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I found himself in desperate need of naval assistance against the Normans, who had crossed from Sicily and were menacing the empire's western coast. Venice sent its fleet, and the Normans were beaten back. In return, Alexios issued what history calls the Golden Bull, a document so generous it took the breath away. Venetian merchants would now be free to trade throughout the entire Byzantine Empire without paying any customs duties whatsoever. They received their own quarter in Constantinople itself, with docks and warehouses and workshops. In one stroke, Venice had become the favored commercial partner of the greatest empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was as if a small local shop had suddenly been handed the keys to a vast department store with permission to take whatever it wished. The wealth poured in. Silks from China, spices from the Indies, ivory from Africa, furs from the north, all now flowed through Venetian hands. The little swamp city began to fill with treasures. Mosaics of gold and glass climbed the walls of the growing Basilica of St. Mark. Marble columns, quarried in ancient ruins and shipped home in the holds of merchant vessels, began to line the piazzas. The city was becoming beautiful in a strange, magpie way, decorated with the loot and legacy of a dozen civilizations. But wealth, as any storyteller will tell you, brings both admirers and enemies, and Venice was gathering both. The Byzantine Empire began to grow uneasy about the growing wealth and independence of its supposed servant. Rival Italian cities, especially Pisa and Genoa, watched the Venetian rise with envy and began to compete for the same trade routes, the same privileges, the same profits. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa in particular would last for centuries, and it would sometimes explode into open warfare on the seas. But that is a story for a later chapter. For now, let the mind settle back into the rhythm of oars in water and merchants counting silver coins in candlelit warehouses. The end of the 11th century brought an event that would change Venice more than any other. In 1095, at a great council in the French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before an enormous crowd and made a speech that would echo through history. He called upon the knights of Christendom to march east, to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim rule, and to aid their fellow Christians in the Byzantine Empire. He called it a pilgrimage armed with swords. We remember it today as the First Crusade. For most of Europe, the Crusades were about faith, adventure, glory, and the promise of eternal salvation. For Venice, they were about ships, because the great armies of knights that would march east needed to be fed, clothed, armed, and eventually transporting. And no one had more ships or better sailors than Venice. When the Crusaders arrived on the coasts of the Levant, hungry and thirsty, after months of hard marching, it was often Venetian ships that brought them supplies. When the Crusader kingdoms established themselves in cities like Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa, it was Venetian merchants who set up shop in their harbors, granted whole neighborhoods as reward for their assistance. The Crusades, whatever else they were, became a golden business opportunity for Venice, and the Venetians pursued them with a mixture of piety and ruthless commercial calculation. Meanwhile, back home, the city was slowly transforming its own government. The office of the Doge was becoming steadily less monarchical and more constitutional. The great families of Venice, grown wealthy from trade, did not want a king. They had fled kings and emperors centuries before, and they were not about to raise one up now. So they built, piece by piece, a system of councils and committees to keep the Doge in check. There was the Great Council, made up of hundreds of noble families, which held the ultimate power. There was the Senate, a smaller body that handled diplomacy and finance. There was the Council of 10, which would eventually become notorious for its secretive management of state security. And above them all, the Doge himself, elected for life, but bound by so many oaths and rules and monitors that he could scarcely go to the bathroom without written permission. It was, in its own strange way, one of the earliest and most successful experiments in what we might loosely call republican government. Not democracy, mind you. The vast majority of Venetians, the fishermen, the glassblowers, the gondoliers, had no vote at all. Power was held by a closed circle of noble families, a group that in 1297 would be formally sealed shut in what was called the serrata, or closing, of the Great Council. From that year onward, only families already on the list could join. The Venetian aristocracy became a kind of hereditary club, and it remained that way for the next 5 centuries. But within that closed circle, decisions were made carefully, collectively, and with a stubborn focus on the long-term interest of the state. Venice was, above all, a city of merchants, and merchants know that patience pays. Let us drift now to the year 1104, when one of the most important buildings in Venetian history was founded. Not a church this time, nor a palace, but a shipyard. The arsenal, as it was called, from the Arabic Dar al-Sina, meaning house of manufacture, was built on the eastern edge of the city, a vast complex of workshops, warehouses, dry docks, and forges, all surrounded by high walls. Inside those walls, thousands of workers, called arsenalotti, built the galleys that would carry Venice's power across the Mediterranean. At its peak, the arsenal could produce a fully equipped warship in a single day, an industrial feat that would not be matched anywhere in Europe for centuries. Visitors came from all over the world to gape at it. Dante himself would later describe it in his Divine Comedy, comparing the bubbling pitch of the arsenal's tar vats to the boiling punishments of the 8th circle of hell. It was that impressive and that intimidating. But the 12th century was not only about growth and prosperity, it was also about crisis. In 1171, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos, tired of the arrogance and privilege of the Venetian merchants in his empire, ordered a sudden crackdown. On a single day in March, thousands of Venetians throughout Byzantine territory were arrested and their goods seized. It was a shocking betrayal, and Venice responded with fury. A great fleet was assembled and sent east under Doge Vitel Michiel, but disaster struck. Plague broke out among the crews, and the fleet returned home in ruins, having accomplished nothing. When Doge Vitel stepped ashore in Venice, an angry mob turned on him. He was chased through the streets and murdered near the church of San Zaccaria, one of the darkest days in the city's history. From that moment on, Venice grew even more careful about how it chose and controlled its doges, and the councils tightened their grip further. Yet even from disaster, Venice recovered. Within a generation, the wounds with Byzantium had scabbed over. Trade resumed. Wealth flowed back in. And by the end of the 12th century, Venice was preparing for its most audacious and its most controversial adventure yet. In 1201, a group of Frankish knights arrived in Venice with a proposal. They were planning a new crusade, the fourth, to strike at the heart of Muslim power in Egypt. They needed ships, lots of ships. Venice, under its shrewd and elderly doge Enrico Dandolo, agreed to build them. 33,500 men were to be transporting, along with their horses and supplies, for the enormous sum of 85,000 silver marks. Venice would essentially transform its entire economy for a year to build this fleet, taking a huge financial risk. When the day came for the Crusaders to arrive and pay, however, only about a third of them turned up, and they could pay only a fraction of the agreed sum. Dandolo, already in his 90s and famously blind, saw an opportunity where others saw a catastrophe. He proposed a deal. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice recover the rebellious city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. Then they could continue to the Holy Land. The knights, reluctantly, agreed. But Zara was a Christian city, and attacking it drew immediate condemnation from the Pope. The crusade was becoming something strange and dark, something that had drifted far from its original purpose. And it was about to drift much further still. Because sitting in Venice at that very moment was a young man named Alexios Angelos, a prince of the Byzantine Empire whose father had been overthrown. He came with a proposal of his own, one that would twist the course of the Fourth Crusade into one of the most shocking events in medieval history, an event that would forever change the destiny of both Constantinople and Venice, and set the stage for our little swamp city to become, almost overnight, the queen of the eastern seas. Let your shoulders soften now, let the breath grow slow and deep, and let the mind sail with us back to the year 1202, when a fleet unlike any Europe had ever seen was gathering in the Venetian lagoon. Hundreds of ships bobbed at anchor, their masts a floating forest against the sky. Galleys with rows of oars, round-bellied transports with wide holds for horses, sleek war vessels with archers ready in their crow's nests. This was the fleet Venice had built for the Fourth Crusade, the largest amphibious force the medieval world had yet assembled. And the man who stood at the center of it all, the one whose blind eyes still seemed to see farther than anyone else's, was the doge Enrico Dandolo. Dandolo was, by this point, somewhere between 90 and 95 years old. Accounts differ, but all agree he was ancient, blind, and possessed of a mind as sharp as any dagger. Some said he had lost his sight decades earlier in Constantinople, blinded on the orders of a Byzantine emperor during a diplomatic mission. Whether or not that legend was true, Dandolo carried a certain cool distance toward the Byzantines that his fellow Venetians recognized and respected. When he took command of the fleet in person, insisting on sailing with the Crusaders despite his age and infirmity, everyone understood that this was no ordinary voyage. This was something personal, something historic, something that only Venice, with all its centuries of patience, could have orchestrated. The fleet sailed first to Zara, on the coast of what is now Croatia, and forced that Christian city to surrender. The Pope excommunicated the entire crusade for this act, though he quietly lifted the ban on the Crusaders themselves soon after, blaming the whole thing on the Venetians, who cheerfully ignored him. It was a taste of things to come. This crusade, unlike any before it, was going to make its own rules. At Zara, the young Byzantine Prince Alexios Angelos caught up with the fleet. His father, Isaac II, had been deposed, blinded, and imprisoned by his own brother, who now sat on the throne of Constantinople as Alexios III. The young prince made an offer that seemed, on the surface, too good to be true. If the Crusaders would sail to Constantinople and restore his father to power, he would repay all Venetian debts, provide an enormous sum of silver, send 10,000 soldiers to help conquer Egypt, and place the Byzantine Church under the authority of the Pope, ending centuries of division between the Eastern and Western Christian faiths. Some of the Crusaders were horrified at the very idea of attacking a Christian city. Others, exhausted, indebted, and hungry, saw only the promise of gold. Doge Dandolo listened quietly and made his choice. In the summer of 1203, the great fleet arrived off the walls of Constantinople. Even hardened crusaders who had marched through half the known world stopped and stared. Constantinople was the largest and richest city in Christendom, a metropolis of nearly 500,000 people, defended by 3 lines of walls that had stood unbreached for 800 years. Its harbors bristled with towers. Its skyline gleamed with the domes of countless churches, chief among them the immense Hagia Sophia, so vast that visitors said it seemed suspended from heaven by a golden chain. To attack such a city seemed madness. Yet Dandolo, who could not see it with his eyes, saw it perfectly with his mind. He ordered the assault. The first attack, in July of 1203, actually worked. The Venetian ships pressed close to the sea walls, their sailors leaping onto the ramparts. Dandolo himself, nearly 100 years old and blind, was carried ashore in his armor and planted the banner of Saint Mark on Byzantine soil. The reigning emperor, Alexios III, panicked and fled the city in the night, taking as much of the imperial treasury as he could carry. The old blind Isaac II was pulled from his prison and restored to the throne, with his son crowned as co-emperor Alexios IV. The crusade, it seemed, had succeeded in its impossible errand, but the promised payment never came. The Byzantine treasury was empty. The people of the city, who had never asked to be rescued, resented the arrogance of the crusaders camped outside their walls. Alexios IV, unable to deliver on his father's promises, was overthrown and murdered by an angry noble. And the crusaders, now stranded, unpaid, and increasingly furious, made a fateful decision. If Constantinople would not give them what they had been promised, they would take it. In April of 1204, the fleet attacked again. This time there was no restoration in mind. This time it was conquest. The walls were breached, the harbor chains cut, and for 3 terrible days the greatest city in Christendom was sacked by fellow Christians. What followed shocked even the hardened chroniclers of the age. Churches were plundered. Ancient statues were melted down for their bronze. The tomb of the Emperor Justinian was pried open and stripped of its jewels. Even the great altar of Hagia Sophia was broken to pieces, and a prostitute was seated on the patriarch's throne, singing bawdy songs. The city that had guarded the memory of ancient Greece and Rome for 1,000 years was, in 3 days, gutted of much of its treasure. And Venice took its share. Oh, how it took its share. Doge Dandolo, still calm, still calculating, still blind, made sure the Venetians received not just gold and silver, but things of far more lasting value. The 4 great bronze horses that had once stood in the hippodrome of Constantinople, likely brought there from ancient Greece or Rome, were pulled down, loaded onto ships, and carried home to Venice, where they were installed above the entrance of the Basilica of Saint Mark, and where copies still stand today. Countless relics of saints, gilded icons, jeweled reliquaries, and marble columns flowed westward. The great Pala d'Oro, the golden altarpiece of Saint Mark's, was enriched with Byzantine enamels and gemstones. Venice was becoming, quite literally, encrusted with the wealth of a fallen empire. But Dandolo took more than treasure. He took territory. In the settlement that followed the sack, the Crusaders carved up the Byzantine Empire like a butchered animal. A Latin emperor, a Frenchman, was placed on the throne of a much reduced Constantinople. But Venice, quietly, systematically, took the parts that mattered. Not the vast inland provinces, which were expensive to defend, but the islands and the ports. Crete, the great island south of Greece, with its harbors and grain fields. Corfu, guarding the entrance to the Adriatic. Ports along the coast of the Peloponnese. Islands scattered through the Aegean like stepping stones. In one stroke, Venice had become a genuine maritime empire, with a chain of bases stretching all the way from the lagoon to the eastern Mediterranean. Enrico Dandolo, having reshaped the world at an age when most men are lucky to still be alive at all, died in Constantinople in 1205, probably around the age of 98. He was buried in Hagia Sophia itself, the only Western European ever to receive that honor. His tomb was later stripped and desecrated when the Byzantines eventually retook the city in 1261. but a plaque still marks the spot today, high in the upper gallery, where a visitor can stand and think about the strange, patient, ruthless old man who had steered a swamp city to unimaginable power. For Venice, the years after the Fourth Crusade were a golden age. The wealth of the East flowed into the lagoon in unprecedented quantities. Merchants who had once carried salt now carried spices, silks, and precious stones. The city grew richer than any of its European rivals. Its currency, the silver grosso and later the golden ducat, became the trusted coin of Mediterranean trade, accepted from the shores of Egypt to the ports of Flanders. New palaces began to rise along the Grand Canal, their windows arched and their walls covered in colored marble. Venice was becoming not just wealthy but breathtakingly, ostentatiously beautiful. And yet, empires bring problems. The scattered islands of the new Venetian domain had to be defended, taxed, and administered. This required soldiers, governors, and above all, ships. The arsenal expanded, more workers were hired, more oak was floated down from the forests of the Balkans and the Alps to feed its endless shipbuilding. Convoys of merchant galleys, protected by armed escorts, began to sail on regular schedules to the ports of Egypt, Syria, and the Black Sea. These fleets, known as the Mude, were organized like clockwork, leaving Venice at set times of year and returning laden with goods to be auctioned at Rialto. But there were rivals, constant, hungry, dangerous rivals. Chief among them was Genoa, on the far western coast of Italy. Like Venice, Genoa was a republic of merchants. Like Venice, it had built its wealth on Mediterranean trade, and like Venice, it had no intention of sharing. Throughout the 13th century, the two cities fought a series of increasingly savage naval wars. Fleets clashed off the coasts of Sicily, in the Aegean at the mouth of the Bosphorus. Cities were sacked. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. In 1261, Genoa struck a devastating blow by helping the Byzantines retake Constantinople from the Latin Empire, and in doing so replaced Venice as the favored merchant power on the Bosphorus. It was a bitter loss, though Venice, ever adaptable, simply shifted more of its energy south and east, deepening its ties to Egypt and the caravan routes that reached toward Asia. And in the middle of the 13th century, an event took place that seemed small at the time but would echo through the centuries. A Venetian merchant family named Polo, wealthy but not extraordinarily so, sent two brothers, Niccolo and Maffi, on a trading voyage to the Black Sea. They did not intend to be gone long. But circumstances pushed them farther and farther east, along the caravan roads through Central Asia, until eventually they arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, the great Mongol emperor of China. When they finally returned to Venice, they brought back an invitation from the Khan himself to send scholars and priests to his court. On their second journey, they brought along Niccolo's teenage son, a boy named Marco. That young man would spend the next 17 years traveling through the vast realms of the Mongol Empire, and when he finally came home, he would dictate a book so filled with wonders that many refused to believe it. But we will return to Marco Polo and his marvels in the next chapter, for his story deserves its own quiet telling. Let the mind rest gently on the image of a young Venetian boy standing at the rail of a ship, watching the familiar spires of his home city slowly disappear behind him. His name was Marco Polo. He was 17 years old. The year was 1271. And he had no way of knowing that the journey ahead would carry him across two continents, into the presence of the most powerful ruler on earth, and back home again a quarter century later, with a head so full of wonders that he would spend the rest of his life trying to persuade people they were true. Marco was born in Venice around 1254, into a family of merchants who were comfortable, but not among the great noble houses. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle, Maffi, had been away trading in the East for so much of Marco's childhood that he barely knew them. His mother had died when he was young, and he had been raised by relatives. When his father and uncle finally returned to Venice around 1269, they brought stories that must have seemed like fairy tales to the boy. Stories of vast deserts and towering mountains. Stories of a great emperor called the Khan of Khans, who ruled a realm that stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the borders of Poland. Stories of cities with 1 million people of paper that could be used as money, of coal that burned like wood, of birds so large they could carry off elephants. 2 years later, when Niccolo and Maffei prepared to return east on a second journey, this time carrying letters from the new pope and gifts for the Khan, they decided to bring young Marco with them. And so the boy stepped onto the ship, and without knowing it, into history. The journey took 3.5 years. They sailed to the eastern Mediterranean, crossed by caravan through what is now Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan, climbed the passes of the Pamir Mountains, where the air was so thin that fire would not burn properly, crossed the Taklamakan Desert, where the sands sang at night, and travelers could hear voices calling names that no one had spoken, and finally arrived at the summer palace of Kublai Khan at Shangdu, the place Coleridge would centuries later immortalize under the name Xanadu. Marco impressed the Khan. He was young, clever, curious, and had a gift for languages. Within a few years he could speak, or so he later claimed, 4 of the languages of Kublai's realm. The Khan took him into his service and sent him on missions to distant provinces. Marco traveled by the emperor's orders to the far south of China, to Burma, perhaps even to India. He described cities of unimaginable size and wealth. He described paper money, an idea utterly foreign to the Europeans of his day, who trusted only silver and gold. He described the postal system of the empire, where messengers could carry news 250 miles in a day. He described crocodiles and porcupines and the fossilized remains of dragons. When Marco finally returned to Venice in 1295, after 24 years away, his own family did not recognize him. He was 39 years old. He had dressed for so long in the clothes of the Mongol court that he looked like a foreigner. His Venetian dialect was rusty, but he came home wealthy. And what happened next was, in a way, an accident of history. Because 2 years after his return, Venice went to war again with Genoa. Marco commanded a galley in the fleet and was captured at the disastrous Battle of Curzola in 1298. He was thrown into a Genoese prison, where he found himself sharing a cell with a professional writer of romances named Rustichello of Pisa. To pass the long hours, Marco told his stories, and Rustichello wrote them down. The book they produced together became known as the Travels of Marco Polo, or in some versions, the Description of the World. It was one of the greatest bestsellers of the medieval era, copied by hand hundreds of times and translated into many languages. People argued about whether it was true. Some called Marco il Milione, the man of a million lies, because he seemed to describe everything in units of millions. On his deathbed decades later, when a priest asked him if he wished to retract any of the fantastical claims in his book, Marco is said to have replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." Whether or not that final line is true, the book itself would eventually inspire generations of explorers. 2 centuries later, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus would own a copy so heavily annotated in his own hand that we can still trace his dreams in its margins. He sailed west hopping to find the marvels of Marco Polo and instead stumbled onto the Americas. But that lies far ahead in our story. Meanwhile, back in Venice, life during Marco Polo's absence had gone on, and the city had changed in important ways. In the year 1297, while Marco was still adjusting to being home, the Great Council of Venice made a decision that would define the character of the city for the next 500 years. It was called La Serrata, the closing. Until that year, membership in the Great Council had been fluid. Any successful merchant who could afford it might, over time, be invited into the ruling class. But now, the noble families decided to draw a firm line. They compiled a list of every family currently sitting in the council and declared that from that moment on, no new family could ever be added, except by extraordinary circumstances. Membership became hereditary. If your family was on the list in 1297, your descendants would rule Venice. If your family was not, they would never rule, no matter how rich or brilliant they became. This was, on the surface, a deeply undemocratic act, and yet it had strange consequences. The closed nobility of Venice did not fight among itself the way the noble families of Florence or Milan did. There was no need to. The rules were fixed. The pie was already divided. Instead of civil war, Venice had committees. Endless, careful, patient committees, meeting in the Doge's palace, weighing every decision, checking every rival, watching every foreign move. Venice would become known throughout Europe for the stability of its government. While other Italian cities burned through tyrants and revolutions, Venice ground quietly on, guided by its sealed aristocracy and its cautious councils. But if the nobility was closed, the city itself was open. Venice welcomed foreigners of every kind, as long as they came to trade. Germans had their own trading house, the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, on the Grand Canal near the Rialto Bridge. Turks had theirs, the Fondaco dei Turci. Greeks, Armenians, and Slavs all had their own churches, their own neighborhoods, their own tavernas. Jewish moneylenders and merchants, though later confined to the world's first ghetto on a small island in the north of the city, played a vital role in Venetian finance and became part of the fabric of the lagoon. Venice was, in its own contradictory way, both jealously closed and generously cosmopolitan. It was one of the first truly international cities of Europe. The 14th century tested this beautiful, brittle world in almost every conceivable way. In 1310, a nobleman named Bagiamont Tiepolo led a conspiracy against the Doge, storming the Piazza San Marco with armed followers. The revolt was crushed, but it terrified the ruling council. In response, they created a new body, the Council of Ten, originally intended as a temporary emergency committee. It never went away. The Council of Ten became the secret police of Venice, meeting in shadowed chambers of the Doge's palace, receiving anonymous denunciations dropped into stone lions' mouths mounted in public walls, and quietly making people disappear when the safety of the state required it. They were feared, they were resented, and they were extraordinarily effective. For centuries, no one plotted successfully against the Republic of Venice. Then came a horror that no council could stop. In 1348, a merchant ship arrived in the lagoon from the Black Sea, carrying an unseen cargo. It was the plague, the Black Death, which had already begun to sweep across Asia and would soon depopulate half of Europe. In Venice, the disease killed perhaps 60% of the population. 60%. Try to hold that in your mind for a moment. 6 out of every 10 people you knew, your neighbors, your cousins, your children, gone within a few short seasons. The lagoon that had once smelled of salt and incense now smelled of death and burning tar. Streets stood empty. Great palaces sat silent. Entire noble houses were wiped out. Venice was not alone in this suffering, of course. The plague ravaged Genoa and Florence and Paris and London just as terribly. But the trauma left a permanent mark on the Venetian soul. From that time forward, the city was obsessed with public health. It became the first city in Europe to establish a formal quarantine, requiring incoming ships to sit at anchor for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, before their passengers and cargo could come ashore. That word, quarantine, is a Venetian gift to the world's medical vocabulary. And still, life went on. Even as the bells tolled for the dead, ships kept arriving, spices kept flowing, and the mint kept striking golden ducats. The plague returned again and again over the following centuries, each outbreak carving new wounds, but Venice endured. It endured because it had to. There was no fallback, no wheat fields to retreat to, no mountains to hide in. The city could only look outward, only forward, only toward the next voyage. And the voyages grew ever more ambitious. Venetian ships began to sail beyond the Mediterranean, out through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic. Galleys reached Southampton in England and Bruges in Flanders, carrying spices and silks, and returning with wool and tin. The Venetian trade network became, in effect, the closest thing the medieval world had to a global economy. Bills of exchange, invented and perfected by Venetian and other Italian merchants, allowed money to move across vast distances without physically transporting coins. Insurance contracts spread risk across many investors so that a single shipwreck would not ruin a family. Accounting itself, the double-entry bookkeeping we still use today, was refined and popularized in Venice, allowing merchants to track profits and losses with unprecedented precision. In quiet warehouse offices, overledgers ruled with red ink, the modern world of finance was being invented. But even as Venice reached the height of its economic power, storm clouds were gathering. New enemies were rising. Old rivals were sharpening their blades. And far to the east, in the ancient lands of Anatolia, a new power was preparing to change everything. Let the breath grow slow again, let the shoulders sink, and let us drift together to the beginning of the 15th century, when Venice stood taller than it ever had before, and yet felt, for the first time, a chill wind blowing across the water. The lagoon still shimmered under the morning mist. The bells of St. Mark's still rang over the rooftops. Ducats still poured through the warehouses of the Rialto, but something was changing in the wider world, something slow and patient and inevitable. Empires were shifting, rivals were sharpening, and Venice, for all its wealth and cunning, was beginning to sense that even the queen of the seas could not rule forever. The trouble came from two directions at once. From the east, a new power was rising among the Turkic peoples of Anatolia, a small emirate that would grow, generation by generation, into the vast Ottoman Empire. From the west, the great kingdoms of Europe, France, Spain, and eventually England were consolidating themselves into powerful nation-states, larger and richer than anything Italy could match. Venice, for all its brilliance, was still just a city, a single small city on a mudflat, and the world around it was growing bigger and hungrier every year. But before we turn to those distant threats, let us stay for a moment in the sunlit heart of the 15th century, when Venice, quite simply, dazzled. The Doge's palace, that magnificent pink and white confection of columns and arches, was being expanded and completed. Its Gothic facade, unlike any other palace in Europe, seemed to float above the piazza as though made of lace rather than stone. Inside, the great chambers were being decorated with paintings by masters like Gentle Bellini and his brother Giovanni, and later by Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese, artists whose names would echo through the halls of art history forever. The Basilica of St. Mark, encrusted with the loot of Constantinople and shimmering with mosaics of gold, watched over the piazza like a strange and beautiful Eastern jewel dropped into a European square. And then there were the palaces along the Grand Canal, that great curving waterway that snakes through the heart of the city like a reversed S along its banks. The noble families competed to build ever more extraordinary homes, with pointed arches, delicate columns, and windows that opened directly onto the water. The Car d'Oro, the House of Gold, so named because parts of its facade were once actually gilded with pure gold leaf, rose in the 1430s as one of the most beautiful of them all. Foreign visitors, arriving in gondolas that glided silently up the canal, wrote home in astonishment. There was no city in the world like this one. It was, one traveler wrote, as though a wealthy prince had emptied his treasure chest into the sea, and every jewel had risen up as a palace. But behind the beauty, the work never stopped. The arsenal continued to hum day and night. New ships slid down its ways in a constant procession. New warehouses were built at the Rialto to hold the endless flow of goods, and out on the seas, the Venetian fleets sailed on their regular routes, from Alexandria to Bruges, from Trebizond to Southampton. Venice was making itself, in effect, the shipping company of Europe. It was also making itself something new, something it had never wanted before, a land power. For most of its history, Venice had been content to rule the water and let the mainland alone. The Republic knew that owning land was expensive, that armies were unreliable, and that farming was for peasants. Ships were what mattered. But in the early 1400s, the Republic began to change its mind. Neighboring lords on the Italian mainland, the Terraforma, were becoming aggressive. If Venice did not seize the countryside around it, someone else would, and might then cut off the city's supplies of food, timber, and iron. So Venice began, reluctantly at first, and then with growing enthusiasm to conquer. Under Doge Francesco Foscari, who ruled from 1423 to 1457, an astonishing 34 years, Venice pushed westward across northern Italy. It took the cities of Verona, Vicenza, Padua, Brescia, and Bergamo. It fought bloody wars against the powerful Duchy of Milan. Venetian mercenary captains, called condottieri, led armies of horsemen and pikemen across the fertile plains, and by the middle of the century, the Republic controlled a mainland empire stretching from the Alps almost to the Udder River, deep in Lombardy. It was a strange sight, this maritime city ruling farmland. The winged lion of St. Mark now presided over vineyards and mountain villages far from any harbor. It gave Venice more security, more food, more soldiers. But it also drew Venice, forever after, into the tangled politics of the Italian peninsula, a game that no one in the end would win. For while Venice grew, so too did its rivals. And in the year 1453, a catastrophe unfolded far to the east that would shake the very foundations of Venetian power. After centuries of slow decline, the ancient city of Constantinople, that shimmering capital of the Byzantine Empire, fell at last to the Ottoman Turks. The young Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, brought against its walls the largest army the world had yet seen, along with new weapons of terrible power, enormous bronze cannons cast by a Hungarian engineer, capable of hurling stone balls the size of wine barrels through even the mightiest fortifications. For 53 days, the city held out. On the 29th of May, in the pale hours before dawn, the walls were breached, and Constantinople, after more than 1,000 years, ceased to be Roman. For Venice, this was more than a distant tragedy. It was a business calamity and something more, something almost spiritual. The Byzantines had been Venice's oldest partners, its first patrons, the source of its wealth, its saints, its icons, its very identity as a city half belonging to the East. Now the great city on the Bosphorus was gone, and in its place stood a new empire, hungry, expanding, and led by young sultans determined to press ever further west. Venetians in the city had fought bravely in the final defense. The Venetian bailo, the ambassador, had been captured and executed. Many Venetian merchants had lost everything they owned, and now they faced a difficult choice. They could fight the Ottomans, or they could trade with them. In the end, they did both. Venice signed treaties with the Sultan and continued to trade in Ottoman ports, paying new taxes and accepting new humiliations that would have been unthinkable a century before. But when Ottoman fleets and armies moved against Venetian possessions in Greece and the Aegean, the Republic fought back, sometimes savagely, sometimes hopelessly. War with the Ottomans would become the recurring rhythm of Venetian life for the next 3 centuries, a series of wars and truces, sieges and treaties, losses and small victories. Slowly, painfully, one island at a time, Venice began to lose its eastern empire. Negropont, that great strategic island off the coast of Greece, fell in 1470 after a terrible siege. Modon and Coron, the Venetian bases on the southern coast of the Peloponnese, called the eyes of the Republic, because from them all shipping in the eastern Mediterranean could be watched, fell in 1500. Each loss was a wound to the Venetian purse and the Venetian pride. And yet, even as the East slipped away, something else was happening, something magical, something that would give Venice its most enduring gift to the world. The Renaissance had come to the lagoon. Now the Renaissance had begun a century earlier in Florence, that inland Tuscan city where merchants like the Medici had begun to patronize a new kind of art, one inspired by ancient Greek and Roman ideals of proportion, humanism, and natural beauty. But Venice, when it embraced the Renaissance, did so in its own way. Where Florentine painters loved firm line and clear geometry, Venetian painters loved color and light. Where Florentines built palaces of severe stone, Venetians built palaces of shimmering marble that reflected the water. Venetian art was the art of a city built on reflections, on mist, on the endless changing play of sun on wave, and its masters would become some of the greatest ever to hold a brush. Giovanni Bellini, working in the second half of the 15th century, transformed Venetian religious painting into something newly tender and human. His Madonnas gazed out with a sweetness that seemed to belong to real mothers, not to remote icons. His use of oil paint, a technique newly imported from the north, allowed him to build up glowing, translucent layers of color, capturing the very quality of Venetian light. Bellini taught a whole generation of pupils, and among them was a young man from the mountain town of Pieve di Cadore named Tiziano Vecellio, whom the world would come to know simply as Titian. Titian would become, over a career spanning nearly 70 years, one of the most celebrated painters in the history of Western art. Emperors and popes sat for his portraits. Kings paid enormous sums for his mythological scenes. His color was so rich and so sensuous that later artists spoke of a Titian red, a deep, glowing crimson that seemed to breathe on the canvas. He painted the doges of Venice, the aristocracy of Europe, gods and goddesses and saints and lovers. and he did so with a mastery that seemed almost supernatural. When he died of the plague in 1576, at somewhere near 90 years of age, he was still working, still experimenting, still pushing the boundaries of what paint could do. There were others, too. Vito Carpaccio, painter of narrative scenes filled with wonderful details of Venetian daily life, ships and dogs and merchants and Eastern visitors. Giorgione, whose brief and mysterious career produced paintings so poetic and dreamlike that scholars still argue about what they mean. Tintoretto, who worked with such feverish speed that his rivals nicknamed him Il Furioso, filling entire buildings with vast, dramatic canvases. Paolo Veronese, whose immense banquet scenes shimmered with silks and silver and celebrated the sheer luxurious beauty of the Venetian world. Together, these artists made Venice one of the great cultural capitals of Europe, a place that rivals Florence and Rome would look at with awe and envy. And it was not only painting. Venice became, in the late 15th century, one of the great printing capitals of Europe. A German named Johannes Gutenberg had invented movable type printing in the middle of the century, but it was in Venice, with its wealth of paper mills, its skilled craftsmen, and above all its huge international audience, that printing truly exploded. By 1500, more books had been printed in Venice than in any other city in the world. A man named Aldus Manutius set up a press in the 1490s and began producing small, elegant, portable editions of the Greek and Latin classics, books you could carry in your pocket rather than needing a lectern to read. He invented italic type. He standardized the semicolon. He, more than anyone, made the book what we would recognize today. Let the mind settle again, let the breath grow long, and let us drift into the 16th century, when Venice, for all its beauty and its brilliance, began to feel the ground shifting beneath its feet. Or rather, the water. For the currents of history were changing in ways that no doge, no matter how wise, and no council, no matter how careful, could steer against. The trouble began, of all places, on the coast of Portugal. There, at the westernmost edge of Europe, a small and stubborn kingdom had been quietly investing for decades in a strange new adventure. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, and later under a series of ambitious kings, Portuguese sailors had been pushing their ships farther and farther down the western coast of Africa. Each voyage went a little farther than the last. Cape Verde, the Gulf of Guinea, the Congo, the Cape of Good Hope, rounded at last by Bartholomew Dias in 1488. And then in 1498, the impossible happened. A Portuguese captain named Vasco da Gama, in a small fleet of 4 ships, sailed all the way around the southern tip of Africa, crossed the vast Indian Ocean, and dropped anchor at the great spice port of Calicut on the western coast of India. He had done it. He had reached the Indies by sea. When the news arrived in Venice, some months later, the reaction was, at first, disbelief. Surely this was a merchant's rumor, one of those tall tailies that drifted along the wharves. But the confirmations came thick and fast, and slowly, terribly, the truth sank in. For 1,000 years, the spice trade had flowed through one great channel. Spices from the Indies traveled by ship and by caravan across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, overland through Egypt or Syria, and then to the Mediterranean ports where Venetian ships loaded them up for distribution across Europe. Every clove, every peppercorn, every pinch of cinnamon that flavored a stew in Paris or Antwerp had passed through Venetian hands and left a Venetian profit behind. That profit was the foundation of the Republic's wealth. Now the Portuguese had cut out the middle. They could sail directly to India, load their ships with spices at the source, and bring them home to Lisbon at a fraction of the old cost. The chronicler Girolamo Priuli, watching from Venice, wrote in his diary in 1499 that this was the worst news the Republic could ever receive, worse than any war, worse than any plague. The city on the water, he wrote, would starve. He was, in the long run, right, though not quite as quickly or as completely as he feared. Venice would fight to preserve its spice trade for another century. Sometimes the old caravan routes proved cheaper, sometimes the Portuguese ships were sunk by storms, sometimes Ottoman politics closed the Red Sea. But the trend was clear. The center of the world was moving. It was moving out of the Mediterranean, out into the open Atlantic, out to a new frontier that Venetian galleys, built for the calm waters of the inland sea, could not easily follow. And it was not only the Portuguese. In the very same years that Vasco da Gama was reaching India, a Genoese sailor sponsored by Spain, that same Christopher Columbus who had once studied his copy of Marco Polo, was stumbling upon the Americas. New empires were being carved out of lands the Venetians did not even know existed. Silver from Mexico and Peru began to flood into Europe in unprecedented quantities. Trade routes swung west. The old Mediterranean world, with its ancient rivalries between Venice and Genoa, Turkey and Egypt, began, slowly and gently, to look like a backwater. Yet Venice, being Venice, did not surrender. It fought. It adapted. It invested in art, in architecture, in industry. If the Eastern trade was slipping away, the Republic would find new sources of wealth. Its mainland empire was expanded and developed. The rich agricultural plains of the Veneto produced wheat, wine, and silk. Skilled craftsmen on the island of Murano, where the glassmakers had been moved back in the 13th century to keep their furnaces from burning down the wooden city, continued to produce the finest glass in the world. Their techniques were closely guarded secrets. It was said that Murano glassblowers who tried to leave the island and take their skills abroad could be hunted down and killed by state assassins. Though how often this actually happened, historians still debate. On the neighboring island of Burano, women made lace so fine that a single collar could take months to complete and cost more than a house. In the city itself, the printing presses hummed on, sending books across Europe. The Rialto markets bustled with goods from every corner of the known world. Venice was still, in the early 16th century, one of the richest cities in Europe. But the fear had entered the room, and it would never quite leave. Then came a moment when it seemed the Republic itself might be destroyed. In 1508, the great powers of Europe, growing tired of Venice's arrogance, its mainland expansion, and its skill at playing them against one another, formed an alliance to crush it. It was called the League of Cambrai, and it was signed by the Pope, the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of Spain. All of them wanted a piece of Venetian territory. In 1509, at the Battle of Agnadolo in Lombardy, the French army destroyed the Venetian mainland forces in a single afternoon. The mainland empire, so carefully built over a century, collapsed in weeks. City after city surrendered or was seized. The armies of the League marched almost to the edge of the lagoon itself. It seemed the end had come. But Venice, ancient, patient Venice, did not panic. The councils met. The diplomats worked. The Republic did what it had always done best. It waited, and it negotiated, and it turned its enemies against one another. Within a few years, the League of Cambrai had fallen apart in mutual suspicion. Venice made peace with the Pope, then with Spain, then with France. City by city, it recovered its mainland possessions. By 1517, most of what had been lost had been regained. It had been the closest brush with total ruin the Republic had ever faced, and it had survived, not through military strength, but through sheer diplomatic patience and the willingness of its enemies to distrust one another more than they hated Venice. And through it all, the arts flourished. Sometimes the greatest culture blooms in the shadow of the greatest danger. In the same decades that Venice was fighting for its life, Titian was painting his masterpieces, Aldus Manutius was printing his books, and a young Venetian composer named Adrian Williard was becoming the first great master of Venetian music at St. Mark's Basilica. Williard, and later composers like Andrea and Giovanni Gabrieli, developed a style of music that used the unique architecture of St. Mark's, with its multiple choir lofts, to create rich antiphonal effects, choirs answering choirs across the great space, filling the whole basilica with sound as if the very stones were singing. It was a foretaste of the Baroque, a music of grandeur and celebration, born in the years when the city that made it was fighting to keep itself alive. And this brings us to a strange truth about Venice in the 16th and 17th centuries. Even as its power declined, its charm grew. Even as its trade shrank, its beauty deepened. The Republic became, in these long twilight centuries, less a mighty empire and more a kind of enchanted city, half real, half legend. A place where the rest of Europe came to marvel, to shop, to gamble, to make love, and to lose itself in 1,000 pleasures. The city had, by now, entered its golden age of festivals. Every year on Ascension Day, the Doge would board his magnificent ceremonial barge, the Bucentoro, a floating palace of gilded wood, and be rowed out into the lagoon. There, in a ceremony called the Marriage of the Sea, he would drop a golden ring into the water and declare, "We wed thee, O sea, in sign of true and everlasting dominion." It was a beautiful piece of theatre, made all the more poignant by the fact that Venice's actual dominion over the sea was slowly slipping away. But the ritual went on, year after year, century after century. The lagoon, in Venetian imagination, was still a bride, and the Doge was still her husband. And then there was Carnival. The Venetian Carnival, held in the weeks before the beginning of Lent, became during these centuries one of the most famous festivals in Europe. For those weeks, ordinary rules dissolved. Nobles and commoners mixed freely in the streets and squares. Almost everyone wore masks, elaborate constructions of leather and porcelain and painted paper, allowing anyone to be anyone else. The most famous mask of all, the Borta, covered the entire face with a stark white beak, disguising even the voice. Behind such a mask, a servant could speak to a duke, a wife could visit a lover, a spy could pass a message. Some carnival masks were solemn, some were grotesque, some were beautiful. Together they made the city feel, for a few weeks each year, like a dream. Venice became a destination for what the English would later call the Grand Tour, that long journey through Europe undertaken by wealthy young gentlemen as the final stage of their education. They came from London, from Berlin, from Amsterdam and Paris, and they came to Venice above all. They stayed for weeks or months. They visited the palaces and the churches. They attended operas at the Teatro San Cassiano, opened in 1637, the first public opera house in the world, where anyone with a coin could hear the newest arias. They gambled at the Ridotti, the licensed gambling houses of the city. They met courtesans, who were among the most cultured and educated women in Europe, capable of discussing philosophy and poetry as well as any nobleman. Some, like the famous Veronica Franco, published books of poetry that survive to this day. Others simply lived at the edge of the glittering Venetian world, part of the strange charm that made the city irresistible. And through it all, the ships kept sailing, though fewer of them each decade. The councils kept meeting. The Council of 10 kept watching. The winged lion of St. Mark still flew above every Venetian outpost, from the mainland cities to the far islands of Crete and Cyprus. But the sun, though still bright, had begun its slow slide toward the horizon, and a new war with the Ottomans was coming, one that would take everything the Republic had left to fight, one that would end in the greatest siege of the age. But that story, the tragic and heroic tale of the fall of Candia, belongs to our next quiet chapter. Let the breath settle again into its slow, soft rhythm. Let the eyelids grow heavy if they wish, and let us drift together into the middle years of the 17th century, when Venice, still glittering with beauty and still celebrated across Europe, prepared to fight the longest and most heartbreaking war in its long history. It was a war that would last 21 years. It would swallow ships and men and treasure at a rate the Republic had never seen. And it would center on a single stubborn city on the north coast of the island of Crete, a place the Venetians called Candia. To understand why Crete mattered so much, we need to remember the shape of the Venetian world. By the middle of the 17th century, most of the eastern possessions the Republic had won after the Fourth Crusade had been lost. Negropont had fallen almost 200 years earlier. Cyprus had fallen in 1571 after a savage Ottoman siege, in which the Venetian commander Marco Antonio Bragadin had been famously and horrifically flayed alive after surrendering the fortress of Famagusta. His skin, tanned and stuffed with straw, had been carried in triumph to Istanbul, though Venetian agents eventually stole it back years later and brought it home, where it now rests in a small urn in the church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo. Such was the tenderness and the cruelty of the age. After Cyprus, Crete was all that remained of the great Eastern Empire. It was the last jewel in the Venetian crown, and it was, for the Ottomans, the last significant Christian island in the Eastern Mediterranean, a base from which Venetian ships could still watch and interfere with Turkish shipping. In 1645, using as a pretext an attack by Christian corsairs on an Ottoman ship, the Sultan Ibrahim launched an enormous invasion of Crete. Tens of thousands of Ottoman troops landed on the island's western shore and began methodically capturing its cities. Kanya fell after 2 months. Rethymno fell the following year. By 1648, only one great city remained, the capital of the island, the fortress city of Candia, what we today call Heraklion. And so began the siege. Not a siege of weeks, or of months, or even of years, but of decades. Candia was defended by fortifications that were, for their time, among the most sophisticated in the world. Great star-shaped bastions of stone and earth, designed to absorb cannon fire and to allow defenders to sweep any attacker with crossfire from every angle. Beyond the walls, engineers on both sides dug tunnels and counter-tunnels, exploded mines beneath one another's positions, and built ever more elaborate networks of ditches and ramparts. Venetian ships kept the city supplied from the sea, running the Ottoman blockade with grain and gunpowder and reinforcements. Volunteers came from all across Europe, French nobles and German soldiers and English adventurers, drawn by the romance of defending a Christian city against the great Ottoman power. Some came for God, some for glory, some simply for the pay. Year after year, the siege ground on. Sultans died and were replaced. Doges died and were replaced. In Venice itself, the councils argued about how much longer they could bear the cost. The war was ruinous. The Republic was borrowing enormous sums, selling noble titles to newly rich families to raise cash, taxing its citizens to the edge of revolt. And still Candia held. The Venetian defenders, under a series of extraordinary commanders, most famously the Venetian nobleman Francesco Morosini, refused to surrender. They fought house to house when the walls were breached. They rebuilt what was blown up overnight. They dug new mines beneath old ones. Contemporary military engineers came from all over Europe just to observe, sending home diagrams and reports on this astonishing living laboratory of siege warfare. Finally, in 1669, after 21 years, the exhausted defenders could hold no more. Morosini, now commanding the last starving remnants of the garrison, negotiated an honorable surrender. The Venetians were allowed to sail away with their arms, their banners, and their few remaining icons. The Turkish crescent was raised above the city that had resisted for a generation. Crete, the last jewel of the Venetian Sea Empire, was lost. When Morosini returned to Venice, some in the Senate wanted to put him on trial for having surrendered. Others hailed him as a hero for having held out so long against impossible odds. In the end, he was acquitted and eventually elected Doge. But the loss was profound. Venice would never again be a great power in the Eastern Mediterranean. And yet, the story of Morosini did not end there, because in the 1680s, seeing the Ottoman Empire distracted by wars on other frontiers, Venice launched what would be its last great offensive war. Morosini himself commanded a Venetian army that invaded the Peloponnese, that great southern peninsula of Greece, and swept the Turks out of one province after another. For a brief shining moment, Venice ruled Greece again. But this campaign is remembered today for one particular event, an act that echoes through history in a way none of the participants could have foreseen. In September of 1687, Morosini's army was besieging Athens. The Turks, using the ancient Acropolis as a fortress, had stored their gunpowder inside the Parthenon, that magnificent temple that had stood for more than 2,000 years, a nearly perfect building, one of the greatest achievements of ancient Greek architecture. A Venetian mortar shell, arcing high in the evening sky, dropped through the roof of the temple and detonated the gunpowder. The explosion tore the Parthenon apart. The center of the building, columns that had stood since the age of Pericles, collapsed in an instant. In one horrifying moment, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world was gutted. The Parthenon we see today, with its damaged marble and its broken columns, is the wreckage of that Venetian bomb. Morosini, who thought he was doing his duty, later even tried to take some of the surviving sculptures home as trophies, only to break them further in the process of removal. So the greatest general of Venice's twilight also became, quite unintentionally, the ruiner of one of the greatest monuments of Western civilization. And even Morosini's conquests did not last. Within a generation, the Turks returned. By 1718, Venice had lost the Peloponnese again, and this time it would not return. The Treaty of Passarowitz in that year marked the effective end of Venice as a Mediterranean naval power. The Republic still had its lagoon. It still had its mainland empire in northern Italy. It still had its beauty, its wealth, its trade. But the Eastern Empire was gone forever. The winged lion, once fierce, now curled up quietly on its plinth and dozed. What followed was one of the strangest, and in its own way, most enchanting periods in Venetian history. The 18th century. The century of powdered wigs and porcelain, of Casanova and Vivaldi, of gambling houses and gondola serenades. Venice, no longer a great power, gave itself over almost entirely to being beautiful. If it could not rule the seas, it would at least be the most delightful city in Europe. And in this, it succeeded almost beyond measure. The music of Venice reached extraordinary heights. Antonio Vivaldi, born in 1678, the son of a violinist at St. Mark's, became a priest, though he was popularly known as Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest, because of his fiery red hair. He taught music at the Ospedale della Pieta, one of Venice's charitable institutions for orphaned and abandoned girls. Under his direction, the young women of the Pieta became one of the most celebrated ensembles in Europe. Visitors from all over the continent came to hear them perform, hidden behind ornate grilles so their identities would remain private. And Vivaldi composed for them, prolifically, hundreds of concertos, oratorios, cantatas, and operas. His set of 4 violin concertos, known as the Four Seasons, published in 1725, would become, 3 centuries later, some of the most instantly recognizable music in the world. Meanwhile, painters were capturing the visual essence of the city. Antonio Canaletto, born in 1697, developed a style of painting called the veduta, the view. His large, glowing canvases of Venetian scenes, the Piazza San Marco under a bright sky, the Grand Canal reflecting 100 palaces, the Rialto Bridge crowded with figures, were bought in great quantities by English Grand Tour visitors as souvenirs of the city they had visited. Today his paintings hang in the great museums of the world and give us a picture of 18th century Venice more vivid than any photograph. His nephew Bernardo Bellotto continued the tradition. Francesco Guardi added a softer, more atmospheric touch, capturing the city not in bright noonday clarity, but in silvery mist. Together, these painters gave the world an image of Venice as a place of eternal enchantment, an image that has never quite faded. And then there was Giacomo Casanova. Born in Venice in 1725, he was, in equal parts, a writer, spy, gambler, alchemist, adventurer, and lover. His memoirs, written late in life while he served as a librarian in a Bohemian castle, run to 12 volumes and offer one of the most vivid pictures we have of 18th century European life. Casanova moved through the courts, drawing rooms, and gambling houses of Europe with astonishing ease, seducing and being seduced, escaping from prisons, meeting Voltaire and Frederick the Great, always talking, always charming, always looking for the next adventure. In 1755, he was arrested by the Council of Ten on charges of impiety and imprisoned in the notorious prison cells beneath the leads of the Doge's palace. His account of his escape, breaking through the roof one autumn night and lowering himself down into the palace before walking calmly out through the front door, is one of the great set pieces of memoir literature. Whether all of it happened exactly as he told it, no one can say. But that hardly matters. What matters is that 18th century Venice was the kind of city where such a story could be told and believed. Beneath the glitter, however, the Republic was slowly running out of things. Its economy was stagnant. Its population had not grown. Its noble families, some of them ancient, were dying out, unable or unwilling to reproduce. Its army was small. Its navy was smaller. It clung to a policy of strict neutrality, staying out of the great wars of the 18th century, hoping that if it did not offend anyone, no one would harm it. For a long time, this worked. Europe found Venice charming, decorative, useful as a place to visit, but not important enough to conquer. But charm is not the same as strength. And out beyond the horizon, another kind of storm was gathering. A storm with a name. And that name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Let the breath grow slow and gentle again. Let the mind soften. And let us drift together into the last decade of the 18th century, when Europe was catching fire and the little island republic on the lagoon still believed quite genuinely, that it could stay out of the flames. Venice in the 1790s was in many ways still the enchanted city we left in the last chapter. The gondolas still glided along the canals. The carnival still filled the streets with masks and laughter. The music of the ospedali still poured out over the water in the evenings. And the Doge, an elderly and gentle man named Ludovico Manin, still sat in the great chambers of the Doge's palace, presiding over councils whose decisions were becoming less and less important with every passing year. But across the mountains, in France, something extraordinary and terrible was happening. In 1789, the French Revolution had begun, sweeping away centuries of monarchy in a whirlwind of speeches, marches, guillotines, and dreams. By 1793, King Louis XVI had been executed. By 1795, France had become a strange new kind of state, called the Republic, though it bore little resemblance to the old maritime Republic of Venice. This new French Republic was hungry, aggressive, and driven by a revolutionary zeal that wanted to remake the entire continent. And it was about to produce a general unlike any Europe had ever seen. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, just months after France had taken control of it from Genoa, he had risen through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army with astonishing speed. By 1796, at the age of 26, he was given command of the French army in Italy, a small, ragged, half-starved force that no one expected to accomplish much. Napoleon transformed it, almost overnight, into a lightning-fast machine of conquest. He swept across northern Italy, defeating one Austrian army after another, marching his men faster than any general in living memory, striking where he was not expected, and negotiating peace treaties on his own authority as if he were already a head of state rather than a young general. And as he moved, Venice watched with growing dread. The Republic had declared itself neutral. It sent diplomats, offering friendship to whichever side happened to be near. It tried, as it had always tried, to survive by staying quietly out of the way. But Napoleon was not the kind of man to respect neutrality. To him, Venice was an anachronism, an ancient aristocratic curiosity, a decorative old lady sitting on treasure in the middle of a war zone. In his letters and orders, he spoke of Venice with contempt, called its government feeble, its army a joke, its councils cowardly, and he saw in it a great prize. The end came with astonishing speed. In April of 1797, a small incident on Venetian territory, a rising of peasants in the town of Verona against French troops, gave Napoleon the pretext he had been waiting for. He sent a savage ultimatum to Venice, demanding that the entire Venetian government dissolve itself and be replaced by a democratic body of his choosing. He threatened invasion if his demands were not met. The Great Council, that ancient assembly of aristocratic families, gathered on the 12th of May, 1797, in the great hall of the Doge's palace. It was the last meeting they would ever hold. The chamber, which had once seated over 2,000 members, was scarcely more than half full. The councillors were frightened. French troops were rumored to be at the edge of the lagoon. The Doge, Ludovico Manin, spoke to them in a voice that trembled. He read out Napoleon's demands. He proposed that the Great Council vote to dissolve itself, to end the Republic, to accept the new French-backed government. The councillors argued. Some wept. A few called for resistance. But most, exhausted, terrified, and unable to imagine a Venice that could actually fight, voted in favor. 512 voted yes, 20 voted no, 5 abstained, and that was it. After 1,100 years, more or less, from those first refugees in the lagoon, through the age of Dandolo and the Fourth Crusade, through the Plague and the Renaissance, through Titian and Vivaldi and Casanova, through every siege and every carnival, the most serene Republic of Venice ceased to exist by a vote of its own aristocracy. Doge Manin, when he came out of the chamber that evening, is said to have removed his ducal cap and handed it to a servant, murmuring, "We shall not be needing this anymore." He walked back to his private apartments, and Venice, as a state, was no more. The next weeks were bewildering. French troops entered the city, and with them came changes that broke Venetian hearts. The great bronze horses of St. Mark's, Those horses that Doge Dandolo had brought home from Constantinople almost 600 years earlier were pulled down and shipped to Paris to decorate the Arch of Triumph Napoleon was planning. The Lion of St. Mark, the ancient bronze statue that stood atop a column in the Piazzetta, was also taken down. The Bucentoro, the great ceremonial barge on which so many doges had married the sea, was stripped of its gilding, which was burned to recover the gold. The empty hulk was left rotting in the arsenal. Priceless paintings, manuscripts, and treasures were carried off in wagon loads. Venice was being systematically stripped of its most precious things. And then, in one final indignity, Napoleon made peace with Austria at the Treaty of Campo Formio in October of 1797. In the terms of that treaty, having just abolished the Venetian Republic, he simply handed the city over to the Austrian Empire, along with much of the Venetian mainland. Venice, which had never in 1,000 years been ruled by a foreign power, now found itself an Austrian provincial city. The Austrians moved in. They set up their bureaucracy. The Piazza San Marco, once the beating heart of a proud republic, became just another provincial square. There would be more shocks to come. In 1805, Napoleon, now Emperor of the French, took Venice back from Austria and added it to his puppet kingdom of Italy. In 1815, after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the great powers of Europe met at the Congress of Vienna and gave Venice back to Austria once more. So the city passed like a parcel from one master to another, no longer with any voice in its own fate. The Austrian period lasted, with the brief Napoleonic interruption, from 1797 until 1866, nearly 70 years. For Venice, they were sad years. The city that had once dominated the Mediterranean was now the tail end of an inland empire whose capital lay in far-off Vienna. Trade shifted decisively to the port of Trieste, which the Austrians developed as their main Adriatic harbor. Venetian merchants, deprived of the political framework that had made their success possible, mostly went out of business. The great palaces along the Grand Canal began to decay. Some were abandoned. Some were converted into cheap tenements. Some were sold to foreigners for a fraction of their true value. And yet, even in this long twilight, Venice began to attract a new kind of visitor. Not the merchants of old, but the romantics. For the poets and painters of the early 19th century, Venice was the most romantic ruin in the world. Lord Byron came in 1816 and stayed for years, swimming in the Grand Canal, writing poetry, and living, in his own extravagant way, a life not unlike Casanova's. He composed some of his most famous verses in Venice, including the melancholy opening of the fourth canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, in which he stood on the Bridge of Sighs and wrote of a city whose glory was gone. Percy Shelley visited. So did the English painter J.M.W. Turner, who painted misty, glowing canvases of the lagoon that captured the melancholy beauty of the fadding city as no one had before. Later, John Ruskin, the great Victorian critic, arrived and spent years measuring and drawing every stone of the Doge's palace, publishing his massive work, The Stones of Venice, which became one of the most influential books of the age. The message of these travelers was consistent. Venice was dying. Venice was decaying. Venice was beautiful precisely because it was fadding. In 1848, a great wave of revolutions swept across Europe. Peoples across the continent rose up against their monarchs, demanding constitutions, democracy, and national independence. Venice joined in. Under the leadership of a lawyer named Daniel Manin, a distant descendant of the family of the last Doge, the Venetians drove out the Austrian garrison and declared a new republic of St. Mark. For 17 months, from March 1848 until August 1849, Venice was free again. It was a heroic and tragic story. Manin's little republic held out against Austrian sieges and blockades. The Austrians even used, for the first time in history, unmanned aerial bombs, hot air balloons carrying explosives that were meant to drift over the city and drop bombs onto its streets. The experiment mostly failed. The wind blew the balloons back over the Austrian lines, where they exploded harmlessly. But the siege ground on. Cholera broke out. Starvation set in. And in August of 1849, Venice surrendered again. The Austrians returned. Manin was exiled. He died in Paris a few years later, dreaming of the free Italy he had never seen. That free Italy, however, was coming. In the decades that followed, through the efforts of statesmen like Cavour and revolutionaries like Garibaldi, the various states of the Italian peninsula were gradually united under the House of Savoy into a single kingdom. In 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed. Venice was not yet part of it. But in 1866, following a war between Italy and Austria, Venice was finally ceded to the new Italian kingdom. In a plebiscite held that October, the people of Venice voted overwhelmingly to join Italy. The Austrians departed for good. The Italian tricolour was raised over the Piazza San Marco. And for the first time since Napoleon had marched in, Venice was, in a sense, free again. Not free as an independent republic that was gone forever, but free as part of a nation of its own choosing, part of a new Italy that was still finding itself. The Venice of the late 19th century began to reinvent itself, slowly at first. New industries were tried. A rail causeway was built in the 1840s connecting the city to the mainland, ending its 1,000-year isolation as an island. Later, electricity came and telephones, and eventually a road bridge in the 20th century. Tourism began to grow, gently at first, then in the 20th century, in a great flood. Venice, no longer the queen of the seas, was becoming something else. It was becoming a museum of itself, a living, breathing, floating memory of what it had once been. And its story was far from over. Let the breath grow soft again, let the shoulders sink deeper into rest, and let us drift together into the last century and a half of Venice's long story, into the years when a city that had ruled the sea learned, slowly and painfully, to survive as something entirely new. The Venice of the late 19th century, freshly joined to a united Italy, was poor, damp, decaying, and quietly desperate to reinvent itself. Its palaces were crumbling. Its warehouses stood empty. Its harbour, once the busiest in the Mediterranean, was a shadow of what it had been. And yet, in these years of loss, the seeds of a new Venice were being planted, seeds that would flower in ways no one could have predicted. The first great change was the arrival of the modern world. In 1846, while Venice was still Austrian, the long causeway across the lagoon had been completed, carrying a railway line from the mainland to a new station on the northwestern edge of the city. It was a strange thing, this rail bridge, cutting across the shallow waters where fishermen had rowed for 1,000 years. For the first time since those ancient refugees had fled Attila's horsemen, Venice was physically connected to the rest of Italy. You could arrive in Venice now not by boat, but by train, stepping down from a wooden carriage into the fragile beauty of the city as easily as arriving in Milan or Rome. The lagoon that had once been Venice's protection was, for the first time, being crossed. Some Venetians resisted this change fiercely. They argued that Venice's soul was in its water, in its isolation, in its floating strangeness. To connect it by rail was to end something ancient. Others welcomed the causeway as the salvation of the city, the only way to bring visitors and commerce and new life to a place that was otherwise sliding into ruin. Both were right. The railway saved Venice, and it also began the long process of changing it forever, because with the railway came the visitors, not just the aristocratic grand tourists of earlier centuries, but a new kind of traveler, the middle-class tourist, English families on holiday, American writers looking for inspiration, German honeymooners, Russian countesses. They arrived in growing numbers, staying in newly built hotels along the Riva degli Schiavoni or in converted palaces along the Grand Canal. They took gondola rides, they visited St. Mark's, they bought glass trinkets on Murano, they fed the pigeons in the piazza. Venice, having failed as a naval power, began to succeed as a destination. It became, quietly, the very archetype of the romantic escape. The writers helped. Henry James, the great American novelist, visited Venice again and again over decades and set some of his most haunting stories there. His novella, The Aspern Papers, published in 1888, captured the melancholy atmosphere of the fadding city with exquisite precision, and his later novel, The Wings of the Dove, used Venice as the setting for a story of love, illness, and moral crisis. Marcel Proust visited and wove Venice into his vast novel, In Search of Lost Time. Thomas Mann, the German writer, spent time on the Lido, the long sandy island that guards the lagoon from the sea, and produced in 1912 his famous novella Death in Venice, a story of an agging writer's obsession with a beautiful boy set against the backdrop of a cholera outbreak in the sweltering summer city. In these and countless other works, Venice became less a real place and more a kind of dream, a symbol of beauty and decay intertwined, of pleasure haunted by death, of civilizations that had passed away yet somehow lingered. Composers, too, were drawn to the lagoon. Richard Wagner spent long months in Venice and died there in 1883 in a palace on the Grand Canal, where a plaque still marks the room. Igor Stravinsky, who loved the city so much that he asked to be buried on the small cemetery island of San Michele, where his grave lies today beside those of Ezra Pound and Sergei Diaghilev, the great impresario of the ballet's Russes. Painters came in droves as well. James McNeill Whistler produced dreamy etchings of the city's back canals. John Singer Sargent painted its light and its people with astonishing skill. Claude Monet spent a fall in Venice in 1908 and produced a series of shimmering canvases of palaces reflected in the water. Meanwhile, industry was creeping in. On the mainland, just across the lagoon, a new district called Porto Marghera was developed in the early 20th century, a huge industrial zone of refineries, chemical plants, and shipyards. It brought jobs and money to a region that badly needed both. But it also brought pollution, smoke, and the beginning of environmental problems that would haunt Venice for generations. Chemical waste flowed into the lagoon. Groundwater was pumped up from beneath the mainland to supply the factories, and as it was pumped, the entire land began, imperceptibly, to sink. The historic city, sitting on its wooden piles in the middle of the lagoon, began to sink with it. The sea, meanwhile, was rising, slowly at first, then faster. And Venice, ancient, beautiful Venice, was slipping millimeter by millimeter into the water it had always fought to hold at bay. The 20th century brought war twice into the lagoon. During the First World War, Italy fought on the side of Britain and France against Austria and Germany. The front line, the Isonzo front, was only a short distance northeast of Venice, and the city became a rear area for the Italian army. Austrian planes dropped bombs on the historic center on several occasions. Sandbags were piled around the bronze horses of St. Mark's, which had been returned from Paris after Napoleon's fall a century earlier. Precious mosaics and paintings were covered with protective boards. When the war finally ended in 1918 with Italian victory, Venice had survived, though shaken. The interwar years brought the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini, who took power in Italy in 1922. Mussolini's regime affected Venice as it affected all of Italy, though the city's ancient stubbornness resisted much of the bombast. Some new architecture was built in the harsh fascist style, but Venice's beauty was too old and too weird to be much changed by ideology. During the Second World War, the city was again spared serious damage. Both sides, for reasons of both propaganda and genuine reverence, mostly refrained from bombing it. When German troops occupied Venice, after Italy switched sides in 1943, the historic center was largely left alone. When Allied forces liberated the city in April of 1945, Venice emerged from the war with its buildings almost entirely intact, one of the few great European cities to do so. But if Venice had survived the bombs, it faced a new enemy that no army could defeat. The water itself was turning against the city. On the 4th of November 1966, a catastrophic combination of high tides, low pressure, and strong winds pushed the waters of the Adriatic into the lagoon with unprecedented force. The Great Flood, or in Italian the Acqua Grande, rose almost 2 meters above normal levels in the historic center. Water poured into shops, homes, churches, and museums. The mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica, which had stood for 1,000 years, were submerged in salt water. Precious books in libraries turned to pulp. Paintings hanging in ground floor rooms were soaked and ruined. The city, for the first time in memory, felt truly mortal. The 1966 flood was a wake-up call heard around the world. Money and expertise poured in from every direction. UNESCO led international efforts to save Venice. Committees were formed in dozens of countries to raise funds for restoration. The famous Venice in Peril Fund was founded in Britain. American organizations, French organizations, German organizations all worked to help. Slowly, piece by piece, damaged treasures were restored. The city itself was studied more thoroughly than ever before, and the vast, complex nature of its problems became clear. Rising seas, sinking foundations, erosion of the lagoon's protective sandbars, pollution from the industrial mainland, pumping of groundwater, boat wakes eating away at building foundations. Depopulation, as young Venetians moved to the mainland where life was easier and cheaper. All of it added up to what seemed at times like a slow-motion catastrophe. The Italian government began to respond, though slowly. Groundwater pumping was outlawed, which stopped some of the sinking. Restrictions were placed on industrial pollution. In the 1980s, a massive engineering project was proposed to build gates at the three inlets between the lagoon and the sea, gates that could be raised during dangerous high tides to protect the city. It was called MOSE, an acronym for Modulo Sperimento Elettromecanico, though it also echoed the name of Moses, the biblical figure who parted the waters. The project took decades to build, was plagued by corruption scandals in which billions of euros disappeared into the pockets of politicians and contractors, and was completed only in the 2020s. But when finally operational, it did work. The great gates could rise from the seabed and hold back the tides. Venice, for the first time in its history, had physical control over the water that had always shaped its fate. But the deeper problem, the problem of what Venice was to be in the modern world, remained unsolved. Because as the 20th century turned into the 21st, the character of the city was changing in ways some found alarming. Tourism, which had once been a supplement to Venetian life, was becoming its overwhelming reality. By the 2010s, more than 20 million visitors were coming to Venice each year, more than 100 times the resident population. Cruise ships, some as large as small skyscrapers, would push into the lagoon and disgorge thousands of day trippers who would flood into St. Mark's Square, buy souvenirs, take photographs, and leave again by evening. Airbnb and short-term rentals were turning residential neighborhoods into hotel districts. Grocery stores and bakeries were being replaced by tourist shops selling mass-produced masks and glass, and the Venetians themselves were leaving. In 1951, the historic center of Venice had housed about 175,000 people. By the 2020s, that number had fallen to fewer than 50,000 and was still shrinking. Young families found it almost impossible to live in the city. Housing was too expensive. Schools were closing. Everyday life was harder and more costly than on the mainland. The city was becoming, in a strange way, hollow, a stage set of exquisite beauty visited by millions, but inhabited by fewer and fewer of its own children. And yet Venice, always Venice, refused to die. It fought back. Regulations began to limit the largest cruise ships. Debates raged over entrance fees for day visitors. Local activists organized to protect housing for residents. The MOSE gates rose, again and again, holding back floods that would have destroyed the city in earlier eras. The city adapted, as it had always adapted, groping its way toward yet another version of itself. And in that struggle, our story arrives at last at its closing chapter. Let the breath grow soft and slow one last time. Let the mind rest in the quiet lapping of water against stone, and let us drift together into the final chapter of our long journey, the Venice of today, and the strange dreamlike future that stretches out before her. We have traveled 1,100 years to reach this moment. We began in the midst of a swamp, where frightened refugees pushed wooden poles into mud and hoped no one would follow them. We passed through the age of Doges and Dandolo, through the sack of Constantinople and the plague, through Titian's brush and Vivaldi's violin, through Casanova's masks and Napoleon's cannon, through Austrian occupation and Italian unification, through world wars and terrible floods. And now, in the 21st century, we arrive at a Venice that carries all of that history within its stones, and yet must somehow find a way to keep breathing in a world that seems, at times, to be trying to drown it. The modern city, in its historic center, is home now to fewer than 50,000 permanent residents, a number that has been falling steadily for decades. To walk through the back sestieri, the 6 ancient neighborhoods of Canneggio, Casello, Dorsoduro, San Polo, Santa Croce, and San Marco is to see two Venices at once. In the tourist heart, around the Piazza San Marco and the Rialto Bridge and the main routes between them, the city bustles with visitors from every corner of the world. Camera straps and guidebooks and the soft sound of a dozen languages fill the air. Souvenir shops sell painted masks and small glass gondolas and refrigerator magnets in the shape of the winged lion. But turn down a narrow calle just a few steps away, cross a small bridge into a quiet campo, and suddenly you are in a different city entirely. Laundry hangs from windows. Children play on the stones. An old woman leans out of a first-floor window to shout down to a friend below. In these quiet corners, the real Venice, the Venice of everyday life, still stubbornly exists. The residents of this Venice are a proud and resilient people. They call themselves Veneziani, and they distinguish sharply between the historic city and the mainland municipalities that are officially part of Venice, but that any true Venetian would consider mere terra firma, mere firm land. They speak Italian, but many still speak the Venetian dialect, a soft, musical language full of words that survive from Latin, from Byzantine Greek, from Arabic, from all the peoples who have passed through the lagoon over the centuries. They know how to navigate the city not by tourist maps, but by an intuitive sense of tides, weather, and light. They complain, as Venetians have complained for 1,000 years, about the government, the tourists, the weather, the acqua alta, the price of vegetables. They are, in short, entirely and endearingly themselves. The acqua alta, that phenomenon of high water when tides push up above the level of the pavements, remains a constant presence. Several times a year, and sometimes several times a month in winter, sirens sound over the city warning residents that the water is rising. Wooden platforms called passerelle are laid out across the main squares so that people can walk above the flood. Rubber boots come out of closets. Shopkeepers wearily pile their goods onto higher shelves. And then the water rises, sometimes just to ankle depth, sometimes higher, occasionally in truly dangerous ways. In November of 2019, one such acqua alta reached a level not seen since 1966, sending water more than a meter and a half deep into St. Mark's Basilica, damaging tombs, mosaics, and floors that had survived 1,000 years. Venetians, weeping in the streets, began to fear that the great flood might come again in earnest, and this time, perhaps, take everything. That flood was what finally pushed the long-delayed MOSE project into completion. In October of 2020, for the first time, the great gates at the lagoon's inlets were raised in earnest against a serious tide, and they worked. Water was held back. The city stayed dry. It was, for many Venetians, an almost miraculous moment. After decades of scandal, corruption, and delay, the engineering that had been promised had finally arrived. Since then, MOSE has been activated many times, and while environmentalists worry about long-term effects on the lagoon's delicate ecology, the immediate reality is that Venice is, for now, protected as it has never been before from the tides. Whether the gates will keep working as sea levels continue to rise through the coming century is a question no one can yet answer. But the reprieve is real. Meanwhile, the debate over tourism continues. On one hand, tourism supports the Venetian economy. Millions of jobs, thousands of businesses, entire industries depend on it. On the other hand, mass tourism has been slowly hollowing the city out. The largest cruise ships, those enormous floating hotels that used to push directly through the Giudecca Canal past the Piazza San Marco, causing waves that damaged foundations and creating a spectacle that many found grotesque, were finally banned from the historic center in 2021. Now the largest ships must dock at Margara on the mainland or elsewhere. It was a small victory, but a real one. In 2024, Venice became the first city in the world to charge an entrance fee for day visitors. A modest sum of a few euros, meant less to raise revenue than to gently discourage the sheer overwhelming volume of one-day tourists, and to signal that Venice is, in some sense, a living city that deserves to be treated with care, rather than a theme park to be consumed. The debate over how to balance tourism with residential life continues, and there are no easy answers. Yet through all these struggles, Venice endures, and more than endures, it continues to create. The Venice Biennale, that great international exhibition of contemporary art founded in 1895, remains one of the most important events in the global art world, drawing artists, curators, and visitors every 2 years to see the newest work from every corner of the globe. Its architecture, film, dance, theatre, and music biennales fill the calendar in alternating years. The Venice Film Festival, held on the Lido every summer, is the oldest film festival in the world, older even than Cannes, and it remains one of the most prestigious. Venetian universities produce scholars in fields ranging from marine biology to Renaissance history. Skilled craftsmen still blow glass on Murano, still make lace on Burano, still row gondolas through the canals, still repair the ancient wooden piles that hold the city up. The Regatta Storica, the historic regatta, still takes place every September, with rowers in period costume racing gondolas and other traditional boats down the Grand Canal. Carnival still fills the streets with masks each winter. The city is not, despite everything, a museum. It is a living, working, complicated place, and it remains, quite simply, one of the most beautiful cities on Earth. There is no other place in the world where a visitor can step from a train station directly into a scene from a Canaletto painting, where the main street is a highway of water, where church bells echo across canals in the morning mist, where the sky at sunset turns the entire city pink and gold. Venice has been called impossible, dying, doomed, absurd. And yet it is still here, still standing on its wooden piles, still watching the tides, still full of surprise. If our long story has a moral, perhaps it is this: empires rise and empires fall. The great powers of the sea have come and gone. Rome collapsed. Byzantium fell. The Portuguese and Spanish and Dutch and British each had their turn as masters of the oceans, and each in time saw their power slip away. Even Venice, which held on for 1100 years, eventually became a province, then a museum, then a puzzle for engineers. Nothing lasts forever. And yet, remarkably, some things last a very long time. A wooden pole driven into mud in the 7th century is still holding up a building today. A basilica begun before the Norman conquest of England still gleams above the piazza. A ceremony celebrating the marriage of the city and the sea, dating back to the year 1000, is still performed each spring. Human beings, over enough centuries, and with enough stubbornness and beauty, can leave marks that outlast almost anything. And Venice has left such marks. The very word bank comes to us through Italian banco, the bench where medieval money changers did their work. The word arsenal, meaning any great military production complex, comes from the Venetian arsenal. The word ghetto, sadly, comes from the small foundry district where Venice's Jewish community was first confined in 1516, the first ghetto in the modern sense. The word quarantine, as we learned, comes from the 40 days that Venetian authorities required arriving ships to wait during plague. The double-entry bookkeeping that undergirds all modern finance was refined in Venetian warehouses. The pocket book, the italic type, the semicolon, so much of what we take for granted about how we read and write can be traced back to Venetian printers. Opera as we know it, with public performances open to anyone with a ticket, was born in Venetian theatres. Even the very idea of the balanced constitutional republic, with checks and balances, elected leaders, and rule by law rather than by whim, drew inspiration from the Venetian model when the founders of later republics, including that of the United States, were designing their systems. So the swamp did rule the seas once. And when it stopped ruling the seas, it kept ruling the imaginations of poets, painters, composers, novelists, and travelers. Even now, in an age of jet planes and skyscrapers, Venice still holds a place in the human heart that no other city has quite matched. It is a place people dream of before they see it, and dream about long after they have left. It is a place that, in its very fragility, teaches us something about the preciousness of everything we build and love. As you rest tonight, let the images of our long story drift gently through your mind. Refugees pushing boats into a misty lagoon. Doges in golden robes marrying the sea with a ring. Marco Polo returning from the court of Kublai Khan. Titian mixing his glowing reds. Casanova slipping through a mask into the Venetian night. Napoleon's soldiers taking down the bronze horses. Water rising in the basilica. gates rising at last from the seabed to hold back the tide. And through it all, the same city, floating quietly on its piles of ancient wood, refusing, gently and stubbornly, to sink. If you have enjoyed our slow drift through the centuries tonight, I would be grateful if you would give this story a like. Share it with someone who loves history and needs a peaceful night's sleep, and subscribe to hear more long, slow tales in the nights to come. There are many more cities, many more empires, many more forgotten and remembered stories waiting for us. Until then, sleep well, breathe softly. And remember, even a swamp can rule the seas if it is patient enough and stubborn enough and beautiful enough to make the world fall in love with it. Good night.